Well, thank you very much, Dan. So today it's Conversations with Changing Streams, part 2. We have an array of panelists who are experts in their field, and I'm going to go around the table, the virtual table, and ask them to introduce themselves to each other and what they do. We'll start with Chloe.
Hello everyone, my name's Chloe Bullock and I run Materialise Interiors in Brighton, which is just me. I'm a sole proprietor and I offer all the regular interior design services, but I avoid the use of animals, so vegan friendly, and I also do it in a planet friendly and healthy way, so I try and avoid the use of chemicals in my specifications and make a healthy environment for the users. And it's very nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. Lara, you're on mute, but if you can unmute and if you can explain who you are, what you do, that'd be super.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Lara Young and I am Costain's Group Carbon Manager. So essentially, I occupy a role. So for those of you that don't necessarily know Costain, major civil engineering and smart solutions provider. So my world is very much occupied around helping establish and understand what the industry can do and what we can do as an organisation within the life cycle of the projects we get involved in. So getting from a very early design all the way through to the construction phase and then asset optimisation. And my role within Costain is helping to establish what we need to do as an organisation to get to net zero and address our emissions, and then bring that to life. So it's kind of a balance between the strategy and the delivery elements. So yeah, and thank you again as well.
Thank you, Laura. Andrew.
Hi, welcome everybody. My name's Andrew Thomas. I'm the most unlikely professor that you're ever going to meet. I'm mildly inappropriate. And I've spent best part of 30 years in the construction sector, working as a director of one of the competitors to Lara's business. I was on the board of Northwest Civils for Burse, and involved in their flip into Balfour Beatties. Since then, I've helped create what was the Centre for Construction Innovation in Cube in Manchester, which was a demonstrator for innovation, low carbon, low energy technologies. And generally, we came up with a little bit of a strap line. We help people do things less badly, because really that's about as good as it gets. And the sector and the industry is very much about incremental change, a lot by being pulled and pushed rather than passionate and enthused. It's very hard to get the senior management to buy into things without that sort of approach to things. I do procurement work, so I help people buy things less badly in the public sector particularly. I help people bid into public sector procurements, so I help them bid less badly. I've also been involved in a number of innovative technology businesses, some of which I'm still involved with, who are helping people buy things that help the buildings be less bad than they were before. And the use of plastics and the need for stopping excessive consumption has been on my agenda for 15, 20 years, and plastics is just another piece of that agenda. And I'm looking forward to interacting with everyone as we go through this discussion.
Brilliant, thanks Andrew. Daniel.
I'm Dan Evans, work for a company called Reelbrands. We started a few years ago in supplying people with packaging, and then it kind of turned out that the packaging wasn't really good enough. So we went into packaging innovation, which led to materials innovation. And now what we tend to do is make bespoke materials for people for their particular barriers, the needs of the contents. And we work right from, the very start of their supply chain to make sure that everything's as efficient as can possibly be, to potentially redesigning packaging so it travels better, etc. And then to making sure it actually does the job it needs to do, primarily reducing troublesome things like plastic. whether it's with bioplastics or barrier papers. We tend to look at a full broad spectrum of everything. And that's it in a nutshell.
Fantastic, thanks, Dan. Well, I'm going to start off with the first question, which is a bit of a discussion. We all know what changing streams does. It's about reducing plastic starting in the construction sector. I'd like to ask the panel, do they think it's a problem and why? I will start with Chloe.
So, yeah, I do think it's a problem. It's a problem in many ways from my perspective, whether it's, so vegan design, obviously trying to avoid the use of animals means that sometimes people go on to petrochemical based materials instead. So it's important to me that shift doesn't happen. I also want to avoid the use of chemicals, and I want to improve, not have an impact on the planet. So it's kind of, yeah, it's a problem from my perspective, and there's various things that can be easily done, sort of supplementing flooring that's got recycled fishing nets. And I know that recycling isn't always the answer, but for the short term, it is an answer to a short term problem. But yeah, I very much want to avoid it.
Lara, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree. I think it's one of many problems. I don't think it's the only problem for the construction industry in that light. I think it plays a part. I think there's potentially certain materials that also can significantly cause quite a detrimental effect as well. But yeah, it's one of the problems, not the only problem, is my key point, but definitely one that can be addressed. And I think, well, my perception of it is that the way and the manner in which we tackle all of these emission streams, that Chloe made some really good points around the burden shifting piece of opting for something else, but it's displacing the emission rather than whilst there isn't one silver bullet solution to a lot of these things. I think the process and how we approach them, so actually having a clear understanding of where are the main emission sources, how do we tackle it, and then genuinely following that through is key, whether we're tackling concrete, plastic, or other environmental impact sources. So yeah, it's certainly a problem for the industry, just not the only one, would be my perspective.
Dan, you're from probably more of a manufacturing side of the problem, and probably in a slightly different sector looking to move into the construction market. Where do you see the problem from your eyes?
With plastic, good Lord. It's effectively everywhere, isn't it? And that's part of the problem, in that if it's everywhere, it means you need to try and find a solution for everything. So when it comes to, what we typically do in packaging, it is extraordinarily simple. Moisture, maybe an oxygen barrier, we're happy. Some protection and insulation, it's not too difficult. But when it comes to construction, you need to think about how strong is it, how pliable is it compared to other things, how well does it weather the storm, so to speak. It's hard. I think I've watched a lot of webinars on sustainability, and what a lot of people forget is that it is solid, it is work, it needs massive collaboration, a lot of finance, and a lot of smart people working on some very innovative ideas. And it is tough. For us, the quickest win is the packaging, the resourcing, things like that. We've already gone through the various problems that comes with microplastics, bearing in mind, realistically, we've only just turned on the tap to microplastics, seeing as it takes a long time for microplastics to happen. And this is not an opinion, and I like to not express opinions because I'm one guy and I don't have a PhD. But there is a ton of science on why these things are bad for you, me, oxygen development, all sorts. So yes, it most certainly needs tackling, and it's going to be really difficult, and we all need to team together.
Professor Andrew.
Is it a bad thing? Of course it's a bad thing. We all get it. We all don't want to live with it. But the bit that and when we look at construction particularly, actually, they're not all doing bad things, When we look at where plastic is deployed in construction, and as Dan said, it's everywhere, and it is. Just imagine the plastic that coats the wires in a 10-story building. How many miles is that? It's huge, but already, because of pressure and leadership to some extent by the more enlightened contractors, we're seeing things, they're quietly picking off areas where they can stop using virgin plastics. So we're seeing now that UPVC window providers are measuring the proportion of reused plastic that's going into their plastics. And the contractors are then using this as aren't we a good thing, buy ours because it's less bad than theirs. And there's this business case thing that's appearing out of it. But wiring, I don't think recyclable plastic is tenable in that environment. Some of the largest volumes of plastics are actually in the paints that we use. And I haven't yet come across an instance where recycled plastic can be reworked into a paint. And it's in installations, and we all know that the concentration around insulation now and cladding is all around fire resistance, not about the credentials of the materials that are used inside the unit. So it's a huge, huge ask. But I have this thing that we're passionate about it, but actually the business case isn't properly articulated. The contractor cannot see, and most contractors tend to be led by either engineers or commercial quantity surveyors at director level. And these guys want to see the money. They want to see the business case, the competitive advantage of doing something differently, because they all understand the cost and this will cost more. But if they can't see an advantage out of that extra cost, they're going to struggle with making that decision. And Lara's nodding because she lives with this every day of the week, I suspect. So for me, we need to stimulate the pull with the clients of those people who are making these big decisions to proceed or not proceed on things, and articulate to them an opportunity for competitive advantage to justify the cost. The other thing is that we don't measure this stuff in the sector. And if the sector doesn't measure it, nobody really cares, because they haven't got a number to go, you're better than this. And we know from examples time after time of measurement drives change in behaviours and practices. Things like the Department for Education started measuring the proportion of off-site manufactured school elements on their modular framework. And it went from 36% off-site to 63% off-site, because all the providers realised that the client wanted it to be more, and they were measuring them, so they became competitive. So they did the right things, possibly, arguably for the wrong reasons, but it made a huge difference. And we don't have that dynamic going on as strongly in sustainability. It is in little pockets. Some things are measured, but in terms of plastic and pollution and recyclability, it isn't. We all know it's a huge problem, a global problem, killing fish and impacting lives, but no one's measuring it. And people can't relate it to their day-to-day activities. So they might care, but they don't know what to do. And they don't know how to do it well or how to do it badly.
Very
That's a
interesting.
good point. This sort of collective brief and the clarity around the brief that, that's driving the project, once that's communicated, people know what they're doing and people will volunteer ideas, and you work collectively as a team. That's kind of what needs to happen. I don't know if any of you attended Waste Build last week, the week before, but there was, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, but she was the retail ops for, she's an architect for COS, who are a women's apparel company, and they use a lot of steel and concrete. So obviously, going off the topic, but it's a similar scenario. But they did various trials of taking refits back for new sites and kind of reworking them and then sending them out again. And it was working out really well on the cost side, as well as, you know, the ethics. So, you know, it's kind of a really interesting journey that they went on. And, you know, you can get both ends of it if you all work together. And they communicated it through their manufacturers and everyone kind of worked together. So I do feel quite heartened to hear that.
Interesting. I mean, the other problem the construction sector has is in its waste and what it actually throws away. Have we got any idea how much plastic content is thrown away in the construction process? Whether that be surplus materials which go into the skips, whether that be offcuts, etc., etc. And then have we got also any idea of when we take that in the supply chain and through the supply chain, how much waste is actually created there? And that's one for you, Andrew, probably.
Oh, thanks, Brendon.
It's the easy questions, right?
I think the simple answer to that is no, we don't really know, because nobody really has a care or a passion about that element of the waste. Really fascinating what happens when government decides that it wants to ask the industry to change around certain things, and it started around sustainability and provenance of the supply chain and purity of the supply chain. They came up with these policies and they came up with some sections and descriptions, and on the end of it they said, e.g. steel and timber. And it was a throw. Someone in Whitehall said these people might not get what this is, and they just stuck on the end of it, e.g. timber and steel. What are the two things that we have lots and lots of statistics about? Timber and steel. What are the things that Lara's bosses, who I was quite derisory about before, allow to happen? All the timber is FSC. So FCM.
FSC.
It's accredited, yeah? And they're looking to reuse the steel. They're looking to plan for deconstruction and reuse from design stage. Why? Because two guys wrote two things on the end of a piece of policy and procurement note. If they'd have written plastic, we'd know the answer to your question, Brendon, but they didn't.
Okay, interesting. So on a separate but related note, I came across that the Isle of Man have proposed a ban on single-use plastics. Dan, do you think this is a good thing? And could we adapt that policy into construction?
I think long term, yes, but we have to consider long term. The reason for that is that whenever you change any bit of packaging anywhere, it needs to be trialed successfully for periods of time. Now, doing that for every individual, it could be quite extensive. Now you have hundreds, if not thousands of things. With the Isle of Man, is that being made in the Isle of Man or being sold in the Isle of Man?
Well, it's in consultation, so I'm assuming it's what's being sold and what's being imported.
Okay, so if you were to do that in the next year or two, then everything would fail essentially, because same with construction, it's everywhere, isn't it? Now you'd have food being spoiled because maybe people haven't tested it properly. Now, when you change, you have people using plastic and sealing it with plastic. They've been doing that for a very, very long time. They are experts at doing that. That is what they know. That's what the machines are set up to do. That is what they precisely do on a daily basis. Let's change one material. Well, now we may have to change two materials because maybe the two materials won't seal together. So now we have to get the best sealing materials to go together. And it's just complicated. It can be simplified, you know, but it's complicated. It's tough. It can't be done tomorrow. It can start tomorrow. We certainly can do it, but it's not, it would be a bad idea to ban it at a snap of a finger. Pressure to move that way, yes, because then we could have this nice transitional period where people remove the plastic and maybe have a deadline in a few years or something relatively feasible. But banning it outright anytime soon would mean utter failure of many supply chains and people's food. Construction, oh, that's a kettle of fish, isn't it? I mean, there's so much plastic. There's so many factors when it comes to putting something into construction. You know, you have your tensile strength or requiring not much tensile strength and all the weathering conditions and all that. That needs to be done over a period of time. We do need a distant deadline. We need to. But the operative word here is distant. We just need pressure to push us there in the meantime.
Lara.
Yeah, if I can build on that, I think, and Dan and Andrew and everyone so far, Chloe as well, but it's a part of a jigsaw puzzle. There's a lot of things that interact with it. So changing one element might seem simple in the grand scheme of things, but actually the knock-on effects can be huge. And the complexity of some of the construction materials as it is already, it can just engender quite a few unintended consequences as well. I think a big part, and I think Andrew focused on it, do we measure it? 100% not. No one can give you a figure of how much. I very much doubt anyone's got a figure of how much the construction industry generates in plastic. I mean, we struggle to do it for concrete, and that's one that's pretty much well known. You know, timber, I'd agree, and I'd say waste is probably an easy one to articulate. The reason for that is because they've probably been measured for a lot longer as well. So traditionally, actually, we're a bit more comfortable in that space to talk about it. And even then, the numbers probably aren't perfect. There's a lot of silos in the industry. So that's one piece. So painting the picture of actually how much does this represent in the industry, we don't have a very good idea of it in the first instance. I think another key part of it that really will be a game changer, and I think on Dan's point is like, you know, a long-term plan and target to do that. Pressure's great, but actually I think there's also a case of the business model shifting. So the way that actually it's not probably commercially viable at the moment to look at recycling cables or plastic from cables to reintegrate into, as Chloe mentioned, you know, actually flooring from recycled materials and things like that. At the moment, probably it doesn't stack up even just on that basis, whether it's time, cost, efficiency. But actually the focus of carbon taxes coming into play, the genuine, you know, a lot of construction projects and the growing pressure around green financing. So actually a number of clients being eligible to access funding, but on the basis or the caveat is, okay, it's no longer going to cut the mustard that you've got a climate change strategy or a plan. You actually have to demonstrate that you're following through on it. And that's a bit of a game changer in terms of actually there needs to be proof in the pudding and not just a one-term, one hit wonder, but this is an ongoing yearly. So, and that I think will massively accelerate actually some of these things, whilst they might require a capital investment, so they might be more costly to do in the first place, actually in the long term are going to be cheaper. And I think the moment and that building pressure and that business case is actually some of these things, whilst, you know, changing a component and finding an alternative and novel material, it can be expensive to develop and stuff. But actually that I think we are going to see a tidal wave of that happening as this growing pressure is coming at from all angles, really. It's going to be a client expectation. It's going to become part of our KPIs if it's not already in some instances. Financially, where, you know, you're not going to get your loans if you're not hitting the right targets and things like that, or you're going to pay more on an interest rate because actually you're not meeting your sustainability targets. The public pressure is a massive one. So, you know, it's all of these things and that momentum. So I think the business case is there. The way we currently set up contracts in the construction industry does not lean towards providing that sort of current innovation. It's not very circular, it's a very linear process. So I think for me, the big movement in unlocking the plastics challenge, but a number of challenges within the construction industry around reducing emissions and genuinely making a stab at this, not dabbling in it, is really changing actually how we set up our business models commercially. And that can be, you know, on a project at a group level, all sorts. So yeah, that'd be my thoughts.
Brilliant. Chloe, have you got anything to comment on this?
After all of those, it's, yeah, I mean, I'm a sole proprietor. My influence is quite small, so it's kind of like I'm looking to clients and I'm looking to supply chain. And clients aren't always demanding things, but I feel it's my duty to not educate. Well, educate takes a long time, but just to kind of convince them to go for better, less bad specifications. And then I've got supply chains who are supplying me with things that are not great. And I feel that a single voice back to them saying, this isn't good enough. So now I've kind of joined with other designers. So I've done it in two ways. So I've got involved with my professional body, the BIID, and got involved with a couple of committees there around sustainability. So we're doing a big piece to kind of educate our members on sustainability. So I feel that's kind of an influence. And also we've, a group of us have set up the interior design version of Architects Declare to get suppliers and designers together and hopefully where we can learn together and influence. So yeah, it's kind of, that's kind of my take on kind of where I am in all of that really, but it's very tricky to drive this change that we need and kind of make those first steps and get people doing something.
If I could just circulate back to what Lara said about supply chain, just going back to switching plastic tomorrow. Supply chain. So let's say, I'm just going to use packaging as a decent reference. If we changed everything to paper next month and used lots of corrugated instead, we would be thoroughly up the creek. Because I don't know how many of you use corrugated, but have you tried to get some recently? Have you seen the prices of timber recently? It's gone massive. So let's now change all of food and all of construction to use those materials as opposed to something else. And you've got yourself a bit of a storm there. And now I think we don't do this in every instance, but some people like the simple swap instead of PET or polyethylene to go to straight to PLA or something like that. So what about those crops? What about getting all of those? How far until we end up interfering with food crops and whatnot, which I suspect is probably a fair way away, and it's possible to do it without interfering with those. But you need such a big plan throughout to make all of this viable. And that's why it needs to be a structured, long-term, well thought out plan from every single angle. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that in there.
Andrew.
Your question of banning single-use plastics is absolutely the wrong approach in the construction sector, because what will happen is the clients will say, we don't want that, and the contractors will go away and get something else and say, it is more expensive, you know, but we'll do it that way. So the cost goes up, you treat a symptom, yeah, and it's a real short-term something. We need, and Neil has raised the question here, and I can see why it feels like that, because the carbon agenda has been going longer, so it's more mature. So we are now used to starting to think of carbon as a currency. Yeah, and there's two sorts. There's the one we use, our day-to-day spending, and there's the one that we choose to acquire and hold, our savings, which is embedded carbon. Yeah, we don't have that in plastic, do we? There's like this single-use plastic something, but no one's asking the questions of, so that's a boiler over there. How much of the pipework is plastic? What's the coating on the outside aluminium or steel casing of this? Well, it's plastic because it's more durable and it's waterproof. That's a bad thing. Yeah, and no one's doing the bad thing question. There's no consequence of doing things badly, and there's no reward for doing things well in that plastic agenda. And it's partly because it's less mature in our sector, and it's partly that it's younger in its life cycle of being an issue. And all of these things follow the same model. You have people with aspirations and passion. Those mature as more people join them and they become expectations, and that's the people thing that you were talking about earlier on, of the public need to ask about that. Then they become obligations, because people who are buying them are more than passionate, they're past expectations. They're not going to buy that thing if it doesn't do this. And once they become obligations, then people start to measure it, because they can see the consequences of not doing it well on their business model. And at the moment, we're right back at the beginning of that ladder on the plastic agenda. We've got huge symptoms and fantastic big noise going on, but people struggle to relate it to what they do every day in their job, in their life, and how they can make a difference to this big thing by doing a little thing.
Can I just bring Lara in, because you had your hand
Yeah, And I think it's the point, and Neil makes a really good point in the chat around this, around the fact that I'm always wary of trying to silo out carbon and plastic, and then you can have biodiversity as another one, whereas actually call it carbon, call it plastic. I think translating the plastic impact into carbon emissions so that people actually, that's already relevant, people get it to a point. There's still a lot of demystifying to do in that space. For me, actually, let's ride the wave of there's already momentum with that. It's more translating, okay, whilst we don't know how much tonnage of plastic that would equate to, because it doesn't mean anything to anyone, but we can equate it a little bit more to how many tons of carbon emissions that equates to. And then actually, so rather than having a separate strategy for each of these things, it's bringing them all together, because actually reducing one entails reducing the other. It's just kind of a different way, a different word to qualify the same thing. So I think the translation piece into, you know, bringing it all into one is key, rather than creating separate strategies, which is a danger we are kind of seeing in the industry, to be fair. Actually, there's more strategies than you can throw a stick at, which ironically, we all have the same emission sources, so you'd think it would be easier to join up, but slowly getting there. And the other one is also, and Chloe made a really good point around it, even as one voice, the fact that the proactive stance of, there's a lot of clients that potentially might not be asking the question yet, because the maturity in this space, even around the carbon agenda, let alone plastics in particular, isn't there. So asking the question isn't going to be necessarily the default for everyone, but raising the awareness of bringing to light, actually, you know what, this is a bit of a no-brainer, you'd be better off doing this, really helps hit home. And it is a slow and ongoing education piece. And then I think also translating it, okay, cool, everyone wants to reduce plastics, that's brilliant, but what does that mean in the construction industry? And what does that mean if you're a QS, if you're a planner, if you're an engineer? So actually, in real simple terms, great, I get the long term, I can, you know, reduce your single-use plastics if you want, but in your day-to-day of what you're designing or what you're procuring, actually that probably have a bigger impact than making sure that you don't forget your water bottle. I don't mean to be crude, but you know, I think it's, yeah, the appreciation of what we can do in our professional lives around this is still quite lacking, and there's a lot that we could do to help bring that to light quite simply. We don't need to overcomplicate the topic.
So that's very interesting. We've got a question come through which sort of leads me into the question I was going to ask, is how can government set the framework to enable the change which needs to happen? And the question was, do you think the impact of the Better Business Act campaign will address the issue facing within the construction industry? The campaign is to change the law so that every single company in the UK, whether big or small, takes ownership of its social and environmental impact. So how does government, we talked about the Isle of Man with the consultation on single-use plastics, and Dan gave a very eloquent answer of why it will fail. So how does it change? Who wants to tackle that first?
I mean, I'd have a pretty quick answer, is we can put every act under this. I would argue that we're already meant to take ownership as organisations of our social and environmental impacts. This isn't anything new. I think it will help reinforce it. I think the big one isn't having, whether it's an act or, you know, a policy, legislation, whatever, the main bit is the consequence of doing it or not doing it. So we can have every policy under the sun, unless there is any assurance and a consequence to actually doing this or not. I think that's where the bigger change comes from, is actually the accountability piece. So taking ownership is one thing, being held accountable would, for me, be the bigger weight of the two.
Yeah, that is perfect, but it felt a little bit negative. If you're shit at this, you're going to get punished, taxed, fined. In my thinking, you're right, bad behaviour should be punished, good behaviour should be rewarded. So if you're good at this and can demonstrate that you're good at this with strong evidence and testimonials and things, you should be rewarded with more opportunities from the public purse. It should be integral to the procurement process of the public sector client. And it just, I know there's a little smile just passed across your face there, Lara, because I think you're thinking, oh, it'll just be another quality question. Yeah, it will, but it's going to demand measures, and it's going to force you to compete with others and come up with innovation that you can see a reward for, as opposed to being punished for bad behaviour. I temper all of that with what was said just a little bit before about the client. I have an observation of working with lots of clients over decades, and that's that they're often really good at asking a really good question. they're not necessarily very good at knowing what a really good answer looks like. So the people who do it well don't necessarily harvest the advantage in competitive terms of being good at it. So I go 100% with what you're saying. I'd just add that bit on the top, that if we're going to have a downside, we should have an upside, because our quantity surveyors will chase the upside and do everything to avoid the downside.
I've got a slightly different take on this. Sorry to interrupt you, Lara, but just my background, so since the mid-90s, well, for 10 years from the mid-90s, I was working for the Body Shop head office doing retail design for them, which was a wonderful experience, great team, very innovative, and very much the way that I still work now with the ethics and animal testing and all of that. So the sort of rewards, the other reward in all of this is sort of marketing, you know, the positive stories that everyone can be telling without having to be tied up in any, you know, anything complex. It's just like really, really good marketing, you know, missing out on opportunities there. I mean, again, going back to my tiny input onto all of this, but my clients, whether they're small businesses or homeowners, they love all the stories that I'm telling them about, you know, this carpet or this timber or, you know, anything. It's all stories they can convey in their own, when they've got friends around, when they're talking to other businesses on social media. It's kind of, you know, there's a lot of value there that is just, you know, doesn't need to be kind of a big deal to kind of be involved with.
Yeah, just to build on that very quickly, sorry, around, and I totally agree around your point, Andrew. It's not just a penalty financial bit. I did mean both, and I think even the added bonuses or the value add around the comms piece is massive. I think as an industry, we've only just started tapping into that bit. It's probably not been the coolest thing to do, communications in construction. So yeah, it's growing, but massively. I think that's hugely viable as well.
Just seeing how the Well Building Standard has been adopted in the last 3 years or so, you know, I've got involved quite early, and yeah, it's kind of really, people are loving having that certification, but they're also valuing the occupant benefits, and that, you know, these buildings are now becoming go-to buildings as a part of an HR kind of. We've got the Well Building Standard. People know that that's a healthy building, and there's better things within that building as an employer. It's kind of, yeah, there's a huge piece there, I feel. So just that if only it could be adopted in regards to plastic.
Dan, have you got any observations?
It's been covered very, very well, to be fair. I don't think I could put anything meaningful into it.
No, that's fine.
I'm a big fan of not speaking for the sake of speaking. So you guys are really good at this. So leave it at you guys.
So we've got another question come through. Are local governments planning officers requiring developments to complete a circular economy assessment a useful mechanism, or is it the role of national government to introduce new legislation? So that's the legislation. Is it local, which can make the change, or is it national? And my observation is that there's pockets of real activity around the UK. Bristol is a fantastic place from what I can see. Brighton is another fantastic place which is developing. And then there's other areas which have got aspirations to really showcase themselves as a sustainable, conservationist, environmentalist area.
So here in Brighton, I'm involved in the Brighton and Hove Circular Economy Group, which is great, and it's all different sizes of businesses and types of businesses, and we share learnings, and it's been a wonderful learning. And they're now, like you say, working with Brighton and Hove Council on a roadmap in regards to construction, but not necessarily interiors. So there's kind of gaps. But yeah, I mean, I'm all for kind of working with the circular economy. I think it's the only way. Kind of everything's here, we should keep reusing it, keeping it at its highest value.
So I'm just going to change the question slightly, and this is going to be directed at Andrew. How much procurement in construction for new builds, etc., is controlled by the public sector, and how long term do they do they view that project? And how can that change if it is incorrect?
Okay, this is a really interesting question. The way you couched that was how much of it is controlled by. Well, arguably every new building has to gain planning permission and building regs approval. So therefore, at a local level, not a national level, there is an element of control, imposition, and strong influence. I think the statistic that you're sort of fishing for is that actually when we look at construction as this sector of the economy that is around about 9% of GDP, so equals quite a lot of money, of that 9%, 86% emanates in one form or another from the public sector, whether it's coming in as public funding, agency funding, departmental funding, or whether it's coming in as additional grants that are administered by the public sector and Whitehall and local authorities to contribute towards private developer funded things. It's well over 80% of the cost of these things. So should we do it locally? Should we do it nationally? Actually, a funding obligation attachment would be brilliant, because that'll get to 3/4 of the sector. And therefore, things will change, because they have to change, because it's no longer I want to do this, I'm not sure how to do it. I have to do this, it's a funding obligation, it's part of my milestones. I won't get the money if I don't do that. Do you know how to do that? No, I'll put it in the procurement exercise, so my service provider will tell me how they're going to do that for me, so that everything works smoothly. And you drive change at the far end through attaching obligations at the emanation of the funding in the first place. Yes or no, Lara? Hello, contracted. Give me the other side of that.
Oh, I think it's the right way to do it. I think the key pivotal bit for me is, in addition to that, so asking it in the first place and making it actually this is an optional or a nice to do, or if you've got time. I think the key bit, and this is valid whether it's a circular economy impact assessment, if it's a life cycle assessment, the assessment is great, but it's a bit like, you know, it will spit out a number, it will spit out an impact. It's so long as that the value is if you actually use that information to inform and drive change. Otherwise, it can be the best assessment in the world. Realistically, if it's not used to then drive any change or make any changes to it, it's kind of a great exercise to do, but doesn't really build the change. So I think it is the next step. So the first one is getting to a point of actually doing a circular economy assessment is the default and a basic thing to do. And I appreciate this is an incremental learning curve, but for me, where we're starting to see it, and circular economy assessments, probably not so much, it's still relatively new, but even life cycle assessments that have been around for quite a lot longer, actually you can do a life cycle assessment in construction. My experience of them so far, they've got a huge amount of value when they're done at the right time, for a start, so not retrospectively, and B, if you actually use the output to drive change. And that's valid whether it's a carbon calculator, life cycle assessment. You know, some will require a full-blown assessment, some you could actually do pretty rudimentary figure to understand where you stand and drive the change. So yeah, for me that's a valuable piece, but to complement that, I think there is a need for a drive to actually ensure that it's used to make changes and an informed decision.
And what Lara's just said answers your question about should it be national, should it be local? Because if you do that exercise at the right point of the project, which is at the point where things can be changed, equals design stage, then our local authorities, if they had this on their agenda and it was part of their assessment criteria that these things happen, whether it's circular economy, a plastic agenda, a carbon agenda, whatever it is, asking those questions of the client animals and their advisors at the point where they're looking for a consent to be able to execute their project is exactly the right time to do this, because it forces the change through the rest of it. So you have to do the local thing as well as the national thing, because the national thing follows the money, but the local thing tends to drive the change at the right point. the other thing that my quick observation on those local authorities, you started off by saying Brighton are brilliant at this and Bristol are brilliant at that, and the mirror image of that is, so of the other 347 local authorities in the country, there's probably a load of shit ones that don't do this, and they don't do it because they don't have an empowered, passionate individual who's in tune with the agenda to make it happen. I'm sure that Chloe can tell you who that person is in Brighton. And we have to smooth that out to get a better national coverage. And therefore we have to embed it into the systems and processes, just like they've done with SAP and energy targets into the building regs. It's caused everyone to change what they do and what they're providing because they have to meet this standard.
I see, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I see a disconnect once a development has been developed and it's handed over to a client. It's washed away, it's gone. And I don't see anyone looking at that lifetime value of that product which is being produced and how that's measured against the product which has gone in. So decisions which are made to cost engineer prices down, the effect of that on the long-term value of the building, I don't think is being connected, but I could be wrong. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, and it was exactly the same with energy, in that everyone wanted to know what the wattage of the building was going to be, but wasn't really looking at what they could do to reduce the in-use facilities management, the whole life energy use. The same things happen with carbon. Plastic just isn't on this journey yet. And you're absolutely right. We should replicate the processes that have worked on other initiatives, and I hate that word, but if it worked on energy and it's worked on carbon, why wouldn't we replicate that in terms of plastic? Because the businesses understand what they have to do. It's just a different currency again. And it goes back to what Lara said before, that let's not try and treat these as things in their own integrity. Actually, they're part of the big picture, the fingers in a glove, and we treat them as such, like a cluster of tools.
Yeah. So just on that note, today is Earth Overshoot Day. So is it time that we consider the different relationship with resource?
I think you already know the answer to that one. I think we wouldn't be on this call if it wasn't. I think considering it is one thing, considering it is one thing, I think the big part is acting on it. So everyone can talk a good game, and I'm not meaning us in particular, I mean in general. Talking about it one thing, sticking to it's harder. It's a bit like your New Year's resolution type thing. You know, we all have the best intentions, but actually making it a reality is difficult. And it is meaning opening some Pandora's boxes or too hard to do boxes up till now. And change is always a little bit scary, I guess. So changing quite a traditional business model and a traditional industry, whilst there's loads of things going on, it's incremental. However, we can't afford to change at the pace we've always changed so far as an industry if we're going to meet any target that we want to close to 2050. So I think it's, a maturity piece that's going to have to skyrocket.
So something that springs to my mind immediately when it comes to overshooting and sustainability, and what I always find tragically hilarious is when people say this plastic is sustainable pet, sustainable that. So how are you making your crude oil, buddy? Where's your infinite supply? Maybe we have 47 proven years of oil reserved and probably double that unproven. It's not sustainable. I mean, by the time I'm 70, 80, there is a chance that there will be none left. So we have no choice. Like, it isn't a choice. We have to change at some point. So let's get really bloody good at not using plastic before we have no choice to not use plastic. Now, I know 47 years may sound like a very long time, but I'm 34 now, and it feels as though I was born yesterday. It's going to pass very quickly. Whatever kids you have, their kids may run out of oil. That's how close it is. It is very close. This isn't scaremongering. This is a whole bunch of scientists finding out how much oil we have, and that's the answer. It's going to run out. It's so facto. I don't personally have 100 million years for it to come to fruition again. Probably won't be around. So we need to get good, get better at not using plastic.
Yeah.
That's that.
The thing that concerned me, I mean, first of all, people I know within the sustainability field know what Earth Overshoot Day is, but most people don't. And the other thing that concerned me was that for the UK, May the 19th was actually our Overshoot Day, 2 months ago. So it's kind of, when the people going to realise, but I found the chart that charts from 1970 to now. So I was born in 1970, and so we nearly were one planet's worth of in 1 year short of a day in 1970, and now we need 1.7 planets to sustain our way now. So yeah, it's alarming, and just love people to understand what that all means really, and do things on all kind of scales to improve that.
Absolutely.
So a dog on the loose.
It's the fifth panelist. Andrew, any comment on that?
Yeah, it's just so wrong, isn't it? And Daniel's exactly right. Just stop using plastics. But steps on the road say our consumption will be reduced if we can recycle some of the existing stuff, and it stops it going in the sea. So there's got to be a good thing about this middle compromise. But we have no choice about this. In 2009, it was only being invited onto this that made me look at it. In 2009, I spoke at a national conference, and the last slide that I put up, purely by coincidence, it happened to be Earth Day. And the comments that was my holding slide for the questions, which is, thank you for listening. I'm not here for you. I'm not here for me. I'm here for my children and my grandchildren, because everything we're doing today is creating a legacy for them. And it's not necessarily one that they want or one that we would want to give them. So we have to do something different. We have to change. And here we are, 12 years later. Have we changed that much in terms of the plastic agenda?
Really?
Probably not. And if anything, we've gone backwards and got worse. The only good thing about that graph that you've got there, Chloe, it was on the lunchtime news, BBC national news, right? And it had this graph of showing how we were getting progressively worse at this thing. It was really powerful. I can't remember ever having seen that level of presence on the national news about this agenda. Did they talk about plastic? No. And that's where we're missing, isn't it? It's like everyone knows it's bad, but no one knows how it fits or what they can do to make it different, which is why there's a need for something, isn't there, to pull focus towards it. And it's why I'm so passionate about helping changing streams through connections, networks, any activity, any support I can give, because it is such a good thing, and there's nobody else doing it properly.
Yeah, I think just if I could just make one comment on that, which was very interesting on the national news. Something which we alluded to early on about nanoplastics and microplastics only just coming into to be visible as the problem and to be measurable as the problem. I can see in a few years' time, in the same way as pollen count is going to be out there and the pollution count, it's going to be the nanoplastic count per parts per million.
Yes, so there's a lot of studies on this, and at this point, this is not my opinion. Okay, just making that straight. This is me saying, oh, I think this or that. The amount of microplastics in rivers is so huge. They can, in some places, there's a very famous picture of a canyon in Spain where they can measure how high the river was by the level of sediment, and that's across quite a lot of places. There's fallout of it in France, and if it's in France, it's obviously everywhere else. It is in the soil, in the sea, in the air, and argue with me as much as you want, it'll fail, because that is what science has found. So that's what I really like about references, is that they're good, strong and potent. And yeah, as we said earlier, plastics can take a long time to turn into microplastics, and we're dumping, many hundreds of millions of tons of plastic, which is eventually going to turn into microplastics over a very long time. You know, in the next 50, 100, 200 years, it's just going to be a constant flood of it. And no scaremongering, this is scientific fact. When we store it somewhere, say in landfill or somewhere like that, there was a study, I think it was in Italy, where in the river, the amount of microplastics would rise after a heavy rainfall, which heavily indicates that microplastics from some storage site somewhere did flush through the soil, did find its way to the river from some distant place. And then it gets into the sea. And we always bang on about the dangers of plastic, and it kind of bores me a little bit to some extent because no one talks about what we're going to do about it. But I do just want to emphasize that it does stop the reproduction of many marine animals. It does screw with plankton, and Lara knows a lot about CO2 and oxygen. I imagine she will know very well how important plankton is. Without plankton, we all die. Not scaremongering, scientific fact, cheers. And it does devastate wildlife. And now I don't want to sound too pro bioplastics, and I'm going to go to PLA as a reasonable standard because it's heavily researched. So your microplastics and your larger plastics, which you typically find in marine animals, they will not be digested, or typically won't be digested. So they will stay in the stomachs of these creatures, big or small. They affect the reproduction cycle, and because they're in the stomach, they don't feed, they don't drink. You know, you have whales and sperm whales, etc., who they absorb lots of fluids through their food. They don't eat, therefore I know they're in water, and it sounds ridiculous. They don't drink, and then they die. And you'll see that in quite a few studies and articles. And that's just, it's a really big issue. The thing is, PLA will affect the reproduction of a fish or something, and that sucks massively. But it will digest, it will go through the system. So that same, however much PLA, depending on, you know, the volume of it, may well pass through that mammal. So we have two things that are quite crap, really, when you think about it. But one's less crap. So let's go for the less crap. Anyway, that's a very convoluted tangent there, and I don't know how the hell I got there, but I did. And thank you very much for listening and enduring. It's been a pleasure.
On that note, we're going to have to draw it to a conclusion. So I'd like to give you each 10 seconds, only 10 seconds, to give me one last piece of advice. And we'll start off with Chloe.
Well, just from what Dan's saying, it's the human body burden of all of this as well. From the last webinar, we learned about all the chemical body burden and what that does. So yeah, it's not just, it's everything. It's in everything. So sorry, that's not.
That's fine. That's perfect.
You're not wrong.
Laura.
I'd say don't overcomplicate it. The topic's complicated enough as it is, so don't try and solve climate change in one go. However, whatever you do figure out, make sure it is the biggest potential impact you can change, and hold yourself to it. Because yeah, so for me, that's the one, is the accountability piece to yourself, and also make it worth your while and in terms of consequence and impact for long term. So yeah.
Andrew.
Go and do things less badly tomorrow.
Perfect. Dan.
Don't do it alone. Everyone knows something you don't. This is longer than 10 seconds, soz. When I worked with a cardiologist, he's one of the best in Britain. He told me I don't know everything about the heart. And I was very shocked. He's amazing, doesn't know everything about this singular organ. We don't know everything about each other's things. It's intensely complicated. Don't be a superhero, because you will fail. Interact with people, work together. We can do something about it.
That's great.
Conversations with Changing Streams, part 2 concluded. Thank you very much, panelists. My closing piece would be, we just need to reduce and change the streams, protect the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brendon.